So, good afternoon and welcome to the first of our RLUK Research Shift Programme series. This is session 1, Defining Practitioner Research. And Research Shift is intended to be an interactive and interconnected set of 3 events, and I'm delighted that we have 2 great speakers today. We have Becky Scott from Libraries Connected and a former AHRC-RLUK fellow, and Dr Cara Rodway from the British Library. And they're going to talk to us a little bit about practitioner research this afternoon. So first of all, just to give people a sense of some upcoming events, and we advertised all 3 of these sessions, and it's been fantastic to see the interest and the engagement from colleagues around these. Session 2 will be next month on the 13th of May on overcoming structural barriers within institutions, looking at institutional funding and recognition obstacles. And I'm delighted that we will have speakers from Bristol and from Durham, from the library and the research office in those institutions, who will talk to us about how they have started their journey in overcoming structural barriers. And the third session is really thinking about how we engage in research, how we can launch and sustain projects, how we can collaborate and disseminate and work with those outcomes. And as part of that, one of the things I really wanted to highlight to colleagues joining us today is the launch of AHRC-RLUK's 3rd Research Catalyst cohort. The programme is a bespoke professional development programme which is designed to enhance the capacity, capability and confidence, those are words you'll hear quite a lot today, of colleagues working within academic libraries and across our research institutions, enabling them to be research leaders and collaborators undertaking transformative research. The Catalyst cohort is a free course funded by AHRC. Becky is actually an alumni of our very first Research Catalyst cohort, and I can see one of my other couple of other colleagues today as well, who are part of our Research Shift programme, who are also part of that programme. So the applications are now open, and it closes on the 13th of June in sort of later this year. It is open not only to RLUK members, but also other institutions as well. So please check out the website. We've got the slides available on Zenodo, and we will be sharing the launch video. So a little bit about housekeeping for today. It is intended to be an interactive session, so please write your comments or questions throughout today's session. Your microphones have been muted by default, but we can unmute them for breakout sessions and obviously for the Q&A at the end. We'll be recording the presentations, including this opening piece, and then Cara and Becky. The hashtag for today is RLUK RSP. And please join the conversation. Raise your hand for our colleagues who are very familiar with Teams. It's hidden a little bit under React in Zoom. So first of all, I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is William Nixon. I'm Deputy Executive Director for Research Libraries UK, and I'll be chairing today's session. And I've had the privilege of working with our AHRC-RLUK colleagues, working with some of our National Archives colleagues and our Catalyst cohort, and also working to pull together this programme. And really, it's been so exciting to see the number of colleagues who have shown interest and who have been really kind of engaged and, dare I say, enthused by this topic and really wanting to join us. So today's agenda, we're currently in the welcome and background. We will have an icebreaker, so that is the interactive portion. or the first of the interactive portions. So we are going to randomly put you all in groups of 3 with an opportunity to just introduce yourselves to each other, talk a little bit about where you are or aren't. And again, this is a really broad spectrum. We're looking at building a community here as part of the Research Shift programme. So really, it's about engaging with each other and making those connections. I'll then hand over to Becky and Cara, and they've got 15 or so minutes each to talk about some of their experiences around practitioner research. We will then split into another round of breakout groups, a little bit of reflection this time around practitioner research, and bring everybody together for some wider discussion and then some closing comments. So I hope that's what you think you signed up for, and we look forward to you joining us this afternoon. So why the Research Shift programme? Why now? So as I said, it's 3 interconnected interactive events. It is about building communities. It's about empowering librarians, archivists, information professionals, GLAM colleagues as research leaders, allowing us to share experiences, develop ideas, and address challenges in practitioner research and also the wider scholarly research ecosystem. It's been co-created with colleagues like Becky, like Leslie and Manuela there, and we're really excited to have had that input and really look at how we can build that community over the last couple of years with our funding from AHRC and our partnership with TNA. And again, talking about those C's, it's about supporting research capacity, capability, but also confidence. I mean, confidence is not to be underestimated as a real factor and a real barrier in thinking about how we engage and how we take this forward. So I think the research shift is a real sector-wide activity. We can already see, the shift with REF 2029 and the people, culture and environment, thinking about hidden REF, the importance of valuing all contributions to the REF, and RLUK is a supporter of the hidden REF and has engaged with them, particularly around sort of the library side of activity, thinking about the technicians' commitment, the role that we play as professionals, the role we play as kind of specialists, and we recently submitted to the recent HISA call around technician roles, and we're very forceful about not being a supporter of the term non-academic staff. And then thinking as well about where we have tried to move the dial in the in the wider environment, and to do that through some of our partnerships with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and with TNA. So why is this so important for Research Libraries UK? Well, we believe that it's absolutely critical for us to champion the pivotal contribution that libraries make to the research process. We can be enablers, partners, but also pioneers and leaders of research excellence. And we are keen that we look at how we can share and bring greater recognition to all the skills and the expertise, the insights that libraries offer, and to help looking at how we build those research capabilities and confidence. And if that sounds zealous, it's intended to, because I feel incredibly passionate about this, and it's one of the great privileges about taking on this role with Research Libraries UK in the last couple of years. So we have had a research engagement programme that's been in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council. If you haven't read it, this report is actually, it's 2021, but actually is really foundational to a lot of the work which has followed in recent years, and particularly with some of our programs, thinking about case studies, but also running events. And I think today is intended to be a little bit of a sort of catalyst and a revitalizing for us and for the sector, dare I say a clarion call around the importance of librarians and information professionals' role in research. And it's a key strand of our 2022-2025 strategic vision. So you've heard me talk quite a lot about capacity, capability, confidence. It isn't just about how many words can we find with C, but actually it works really well because as this program has evolved, as our partnerships have evolved, it's become very clear that we also need to be thinking about the wider research culture in which we can both engage with, but also perhaps shape and inform. How important it is for us to be as inclusive as possible. So as I said earlier, the Research Catalyst cohort program isn't just about Research Libraries UK, it extends beyond RLUK. It's about being as broad-based and as inclusive as possible, really recognizing that breadth of research which we do. And it's about community. It's about bringing you all together today. It's about why we are really looking at putting you into some groups to have some discussions and really sort of cut across some of the silos that sometimes we work in a very, very daily basis, and to really make those connections. So we are all about building a welcoming, inclusive community of practice, and we are delighted that you are along with us for this journey. So I want to just highlight a couple of things. This session was called Defining Practitioner Research. It seems kind of important to possibly mention that. Now, this definition is an amalgam of a piece from 2010 about doing work-based research. It's actually available in the University of Worcester's institutional repository as a book. And we have sort of done some tweaks to this to comment that practitioner research and research libraries refers to intentional systematic inquiry conducted by professionals into their own practices, collections, environments, or services, aiming to generate actionable insights and contribute to professional and scholarly understanding. So I think that might sound a little dry. So what I wanted to do was just to highlight a couple of examples of some of our fellowships with TNA and with RLUK. These were from some of our first fellowships, and I wanted to draw these out because they're an interesting kind of contrast, because practitioner research and scholarly research for librarians isn't just about special collections and heritage or archives, but there was a really fantastic work which has been done around creating a framework for managing at-risk assets of Catholic research, Catholic religious orders. But at the other end of the spectrum, there was work done at Leeds Beckett around open data and interdisciplinary research collaboration, really thinking about how libraries can accelerate collaboration and support open data. So I think that helps to demonstrate the sort of the broad spectrum of the kinds of research and activity which are undertaken. And with our TNA fellowships, this is actually also a presentation which was done through our Inclusive Collections, Inclusive Libraries with Jenny Shaw, and that was focusing on diversity and inclusion in UK archival development. And the TNA and the RLUK professional practice schemes enable organisations to gain experience and expertise around that. And it's about raising the collection, raising the profile of collections development work and how this can support improving access, diversity and inclusion of that material. So I'm delighted to introduce Becky Rebecca Scott to talk about exploring definitions of practitioner research. I'm really excited to hear this talk, and Not to embarrass Becky, but she told me once that her superpower is enthusiasm, and it absolutely is. And she has been a fantastic one of our second round of fellows, and she's also an alumni of the Research Catalyst cohort. And we will put a link to that in the chat as well, if people are interested in applying. But I'm going to hand over to Becky and look forward to your presentation. So thanks very much, Becky.
Thanks, William, and thank you to my fellow Research Shift steering group members who suddenly I find myself here, thanks to all of you. So it's great to be here and discuss kind of definitions of practitioner research. And so I thought just to say I currently work as a project manager for Libraries Connected. I've been at Libraries Connected since January. But I'm sharing these slides on my previous role, kind of branding, because when I was doing my research, I was working as an academic librarian and information manager at the University of Hertfordshire. So thanks for having me. So I thought when I was talking about this topic, practitioner research and different definitions, I should go back to the beginning of my career, which makes me feel quite old. But if we go back about 12 years ago, I was a school librarian. And this library that you see before you was the library that I managed, and please excuse the overly full shelves because at this time it really needed a weed. But I wanted to talk about questions because how I got kind of into this topic of practitioner research was really around questions. So as a school librarian, I was also undertaking my master's at UCL. And the more I read, the more I started to think. And it became a bit of a problem because I would come into work, speak to my colleague and say, today I'm wondering this. So, for example, some of the questions I would have about my practice were, how many front-facing books is the right number in order to engage a child as they move through the library space? How does gender influence how children move in the library space? And what might that mean for where I put the furniture? And I'm really interested in poetry. That might come out later, but what happens if I move the poetry from one section of the library to another? Will that increase the number of uses, for example? These are all the questions or the curiosity I had about the space that I was working in. And I thought these questions are interesting because they can help us start to define what we mean when we think about practitioner research. So I think there are really two defining characteristics. The first one is embodied knowledge. The thoughts and perceptions I had about the world are really rooted in the space that I was working in. So it was really that physicality of space, but also my thoughts about that space. So this kind of embodied knowledge. And the second kind of characteristic is professional competence. I had the skills, the education, the training in order to deliver the role. And these two things to come together, and to me, they kind of shape what practitioner research is. Kerwood would argue that it's an example of this situated cognition, i.e., the way that we know something and the way that we do something are completely inseparable. So I knew how to be a school librarian by doing it, or at least by learning to do it, but also engaging with other things. But it couldn't be separated from what I knew because what I knew was this embodied experience. And so before we kind of move on and unpick some kind of definitions a bit more, I thought it'd be interesting to just unpick this idea of terminology. Because when I started out on my research journey, I used to refer to practitioner research as practice-based research. But when we look at this in the literature a bit more, it tries to separate out these two terms as practice-led and practice-based. Practice-led being the new knowledge that is created about practice through research, practice-based being the production of some sort of creative artifact, maybe, or some sort of product, and that is the culmination of the contribution of knowledge. So my research was about academic librarians' experiences of undertaking practitioner research. I was doing a narrative inquiry over a 9 month period, exploring people's experiences in depth of undertaking a research project. Now, my output was actually 62 narrative poems, which was not planned at the beginning, but that is what the output was. So I would argue that it was both practice-led. I was very much an insider researcher experiencing the same thing as my participants, but also it was practice-based. I produced this kind of narrative poetry as part of the output of the project. So if we think then that practitioner research is about the new pursuit of new knowledge about practice, we can look at these definitions a bit more. So Fullington West and Alberillo have written, or they write the introduction to this book about practitioner research. Well worth a read if you want to kind of explore different approaches to practitioner research and realize that people make mistakes as they go along the journey. And it's okay to make mistakes if you're a beginner. So we have this formal kind of research, which we might consider as kind of in the academic domain, that is sort of shaped by sort of standardized processes. You might go through ethics review, you've written a research proposal, you might seek funding and so on. So really formal, systematized research. And then there might also be informal practitioner research that you might have already done and not even realized it. It might be you've undertaken some user experience studies about usage of your library. You might have observed people and made notes about how they move and then made some changes in the space. It's usually about assessing services and evaluating and ultimately leading to an improvement for the user. It could be to inform decision making. And the decisions you make are not always going to be good ones. By the way, you might be looking at space usage to close one library, for example. And it's not necessarily benign either. It could be that your research, which you put out in the world with all good intention, is suddenly used to inform a policy decision that you don't agree with. So I think it is important to think about those aspects of practitioner research as well. But going back to the definitions of practice-led and practice-based, I take you to Kundi, who talked about these two things in relation to PhD research. She says practice-led research should have some sort of operational significance. So it's not about building complex theories like you might see in traditional academic research, but it's about application to practice. And I think in terms of the research that we might be interested in, we might really be interested in that operational significance. What change is going to happen in libraries as a result of this? Now, I think practitioner research can also be future looking as well, not necessarily rooted in the now. It might be informed by the now, but it might also be thinking about where do our services go next, or what can we learn outside of our own context. So there is this wonderful study that I came across as I explored all the literature around practitioner research, and it's about conceptual metaphors. So Cram et al. Look at scholars, academics they mean, practitioners, and then people that are both scholar and practitioner. And they found that there are these three different conceptions, metaphorical conceptions of what it is to be a practitioner researcher. And they're distinctive to that specific role as opposed to the one or the other kind of on their own. So the practitioner researcher is a translator. So this will be really familiar to anyone who works in the kind of library and information profession. Their role is to create information that is relatable and accessible. So the focus for their research is not necessarily, again, that complex theory building, but it's about making outputs that are useful in practice. So really thinking about translation of knowledge. The next one is about being a connector, being a bridge between two different worlds. So it accepts that we conceive as practice as one world and research as a separate world, and that the role of the practitioner researcher is to cross those two divides and make meaning for others. And the third one, they use the term cycler, which is a slightly odd description of a term, but essentially they mean that the practitioner researcher moves between action, the things that they do, and knowledge, and that this is sort of a virtuous circle that kind of constantly is in motion. And it's the synergy that they identify between research and practice that stimulate new ideas and inspire each other so that these two roles are constantly or hopefully mutually beneficial. However, being a practitioner researcher often involves spanning these two different domains. Research, if you consider it perhaps this sort of icy landscape, and practice, maybe this desert landscape, and the practitioner researcher is crossing between these two boundaries. It isn't necessarily a comfortable place. A practitioner researcher might experience identity struggles as they try to negotiate the professional competence that they already have in practice, whilst developing a whole new professional competence that is navigating the research landscape. They might need to develop new language and new practices and new ways of negotiating in this different space. So this interconnectedness that Cram et al. Talk about in this virtuous circle can lead to really positive synergies. And certainly that was my experience. But it's not necessarily a peaceful or collaborative space, argue Wenger, and Trainer. So Wenger, Trainer, and Wenger, Trainer. Yes, they have the same surnames. So that's a bit of a mouthful. But it's not necessarily peaceful or collaborative as we span different communities of practice. So as I'm moving towards the end of my talk, I thought I would just come back to this study that I read really early on. It's about the different conceptions that librarians and archivists have of research. They identified six particular conceptions of research, but I wanted to pick out three of them based on my own research. So what I want to first say is in my research, I found that through librarians' stories of undertaking their research journey, that they were really emotion laden and that these emotions went up and down and all over the place during the course of their research journey. They may have started out really optimistic, but by the end, they may have completely disengaged with their research process. They found in their research that it was a shared community experience, and that's certainly the case. But what more I found was that their community experience was really influenced by wider socio-political narratives about the role of professional services within academia, for example. I'm going to come back to the second one at the end, but I'll now pick out the third one. So research by librarians and archivists is not considered real research. So one of my participants certainly really struggled to call herself a practitioner researcher. And when she did, she was always saying, but I don't consider it real research because she couldn't equate her own impact as a researcher in the same way she could for other disciplines that she supported as an academic librarian, because she felt that you could still see the real benefit of certain interventions in healthcare, but you didn't necessarily see those in kind of library practice. So she really struggled with that. But if I go back, because I want to end with the story that I started with the person who was once a school librarian who really was curious. And this is one of the absolute benefits of practitioner research. It can lead to learning and it can certainly lead to personal growth. And through my researching other librarians, I'm now in a completely different role with Libraries Connected, supporting workforce development. So I guess I want to end by saying, if you really are interested in research, pursue some of the support that is available, because it's much easier to take this journey with other people kind of holding your hand. And that's why I felt that having this community was really important. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, William, and thank you to Becky. That was really thought-provoking. I think our presentations work very nicely as a pair because whereas Becky, I think, was encouraging us to think about practice-led and practice-based research in a kind of broad frame, I have dived in to sort of think about some examples of how this plays out inside the British Library. So I am indeed Cara Rodway. I'm the head of research development at the British Library. So we, oh, why is my slide not advancing? Sorry. There we go. So the British Library, obviously, I've got a number of colleagues who are on the call, so it's very nice to see you. And I'm sure everyone has some kind of understanding of what the BL is. We are the National Library of the UK. We're a very big building on the Euston Road. We also have our second site up in Boston Spa, and then plans for further locations in Leeds and redevelopment of our King's Cross site. But we are obviously also our collection, and my team, so research development inside the library, we support. The library's a research organisation. We don't work with researchers in the reading rooms. We work with our staff and affiliated researchers. So affiliated researchers, we used to mean PhD students, fellows, people who've come to the library, kind of are working with us kind of behind the scenes is how I would term it. And as I'm sure you'll also all feel familiarity, that staff body is very diverse, particularly in terms of kinds of experiences of research and research trajectories. So we have people who may have come through a kind of formal scholarly research route. They may have done a master's, a PhD. They may sort of have gained expertise through the academic route, as well as now kind of professional experience. When we have others who've come through kind of maybe different routes, archival or library studies backgrounds, colleagues who have all of their training through practice. And then with that kind of mix of backgrounds, you then have obviously levels of sort of comfort perhaps with the sort of formal research landscape. So Becky's notes about kind of where we think of ourselves as kind of practice-led researchers doing practice-based research, that can really rang very true for me, because yes, we do have some colleagues who feel very confident in sort of funding, applying for research funding from a UKRI, and then other colleagues who, and the example Becky gave, might feel odd describing themselves as researchers. So I helped produce a research strategy for the library. I'll pop that link in the chat later. That is a hyperlink when we share the slides. But just to point to the fact that one of the main sort of underpinnings really for the research strategy was about research culture and collaboration. So really supporting staff to develop the necessary skills. So then in this slide, I just want to give a sense of the many different ways that, so inside the library, we have about, it's very hard to know how many staff are research active. Obviously depends how you cut it. There's a version obviously that says all of us can be, because we have our professional experience, and we can undertake kind of rigorous research using that knowledge and using those skills. And practically, it's probably more in the hundreds rather than the full staff body of people who are interested in being involved in the kind of slate of programs and things that me and my team offer. So we have research projects. These are often collaborative. That's an obvious way that people get involved. That's either with library staff leading or being approached by external collaborators. We then have our PhD program. So we have PhD placement scheme and our doctoral fellowship scheme. Those are short-term schemes where we bring a doctoral student in. So they're supervised by library staff members. Obviously, that's another way for staff to get involved in research activity. And we then also have our collaborative doctoral studentship. Some of you may be familiar with AHRC's Collaborative Doctoral Partnerships Programme, which is our main scheme for supporting fully collaborative studentships. So those are obviously 4-year projects where the student is co-supervised by the library and by an HEI. We then also have external fellowship schemes that bring, sort of saying, affiliated researchers into the library. Some of them are general, and we running calls internally to kind of find the right topics, and some of them are more subject specific. So we have an America's Institute called the Eccles Institute. They have a fellowship program, but that's focused on that region of the world. The JS Lee Fellowship is about Chinese art history. So we have a few which are quite specific. And then we have other internal opportunities which are just for staff. So we have a POT, the Coleridge Fellowship, which was is a gift, a request donation. And the donors wanted to support staff to conduct their own research. So that sort of is kind of 3-4 month research breaks. And then we have other schemes. So we have a events fund. And that was just to give a sense of the different ways that people do get involved. I mentioned research projects, which is probably one of the most obvious. And that's can be national, international partnerships. We get involved in around between about 50 and 60 in a normal year. I have to say last year it was more like 30, but that was the result of the cyber attack, which massively curtailed a lot of activity. But then we have the topic of today of practice-based research. And so the range of research that happens at the library, some of it, and particularly obviously the stuff that's happening in the reading rooms, can be any discipline, many disciplines. We find that we're approached around a broad range of research involving libraries, staff and affiliated researchers. So some of that might be more classical sort of historical research or other forms. But for folks of today, practice-based research, that research doesn't just happen inside discrete projects. A lot of it happens as part of business as usual, and that's one of the things that I think is really interesting to think about, particularly when we're working in sort of and thinking about our relationship to research funding, for example. But actually, a lot of this work happens anyway, and it's how do we encourage colleagues to think about that, and then think about how can they kind of maximize that into or raise the visibility perhaps through different, and some things have their own output. So exhibitions obviously have a really nice, clear sort of output. And that's a really nice example, I think, of practice-based research. And then, as my bullets suggest, we have lots of other sort of examples of how practice-based research can happen in the library. And so what I'm going to do is just go through a few sort of examples to pull them out, just to help people think about some of these, and maybe prompt some conversation. So some examples. So we have, so provenance is obviously a topic of interest for a lot of library professionals, both inside the BL and further afield. You know, how did our collections come to be as they are? You know, what's the ownership histories of certain items? How do things end up in our collections? And one of the things I wanted to point to is that I think that, you know, the provenance is a really good example of why you need the skills of you know, a librarian or an archivist to really help you know, use the you know, the knowledge that we have, and, you know, make the most of our collections and the stories they can tell, as well as then obviously using other, you know, research resources to kind of unpack those topics. But also that within a library context, it's not, you know, we're not just, and I really like that point about kind of operational significance that Becky made, because I think that's so true. So the I've noted a couple of our PhD projects at the moment which really engage with the topic of provenance, and the first one there is about oral history, which is a nice example because my colleagues in the oral history team were really keen to think about what's the implication for users who might want to reuse oral history collections, when, you know, how much provenance material do they need to know in order to effectively reuse things once, you know, say recordings are outside of the context in which they were originally produced. So that's, I think, again, very sort of user focused one. And then similarly, the second project I've mentioned there, which is about Paul Hirsch, who was the, as the title notes, Jewish emigre music collector who came to the UK, and his collection eventually ended up in the British Library. And that's thinking about how his collection formed. And there's obviously some interesting questions given the period that he's collecting around possible topics like spoliation, but also just thinking more about kind of, you know, intellectual exchange, you know, how and financial exchange, what these networks look like in Europe around this time. And then I thought that the Paul Hirsch project is a nice example, though, of actually how some of the really basic core work of a library, you know, is research, because the one of the reasons that we're in a position to encourage a student to come in and undertake this work on the Hirsch collection is because it was recently been more extensively catalogued. So the library has an internal program called Unlocking Our Hidden Collections, and that as part of that program, there was some deeper cataloguing work done on the Paul Hirsch papers, and I can share this link again, but this was a really lovely blog from the cataloguer who worked on that collection talking about it. And I've taken one of her images to illustrate this slide, but that's a really nice example of how actually, you know, that initial work that she's undertaking as a cataloguer, the research that she's doing in order to ensure her catalogue records are, you know, as good as they can be to support future researchers, that opened up the collections enough to then be able to do this this further research work on it. And then just to point to some other areas of kind of library practice which involve practice-based research. So preservation and storage is an obvious one. So we're currently involved in a collaborative research project that's looking at sustainability in storage, thinking particularly about digital versus kind of physical preservation strategies, called Reverdi, which is an international collaboration. And then similarly, colleagues in conservation, we do have conservation scientists at the library. We have two. And so, yeah, they're involved in obviously a number of studies, obviously, where they're using their, you know, their specific expertise to support the work that's being done. And then I just wanted to also to think about curation as an area of practice. So we have a couple of nice examples of where colleagues have been supported by outside bodies to kind of give them the space to undertake new projects that have really then helped build both their professional practice, but the collection more broadly. So my colleague Daniel Lowe, who's curator for Arabic collections, received an Art Fund New Collecting Award back in 2022, and it's a 2-year award. He was able to get some mentorship as well as support to, and I think in the end he's collected about 200 new items to develop the library's collection. But it's really interesting hearing him talk about actually how much research went into that, and it's not just things like, you know, understanding kind of publishing environment. There's also obviously a lot of different, you know, a broader thinking about culture and politics, and, you know, and all those sort of threads that go into effective curation. And then I obviously had to mention my good wonderful colleague Rositza, who is formerly of this parish as a AHRC-RLUK professional practice fellow. And so Rositza, if you don't know her, is a digital curator at the BL, and she did a fantastic project using digital humanities approaches to understand and extract information from some of our early catalogues of printed books, early printed books in Canabula. And so that was a really lovely example of applying new knowledge and new processes to the collection to generate new knowledge. And then just, I think this is my final one, just to point to the fact that again, that operational significance is really important. We always are trying to think about how we can better understand policy and practice through our research kind of activities. And we've got a really nice another PhD program, a project on the go at the moment, which is exploring the impact of cultural programming in UK public libraries. So that's making use of the Living Knowledge network, which some of you will be familiar with, which is a network of public libraries that the BL is the kind of the sort of organizational center for. And we travel a lot of our cultural exhibitions out to the libraries, and we were very keen to think about how can we understand the impact that culture in local libraries can make as part of a kind of broader point. Again, going back to Becky was saying about, you know, about wanting to influence policy and to help the sector and make the case for itself. And then finally, I just wanted to point to some of the ways that we're thinking about creative practice-based research inside the library. So I didn't mention it because I was running out of space on my slides, but we do have an author currently doing a creative practice PhD with us, but we also have other opportunities. So, for example, one of our affiliated researchers is the Fulbright British Library Eccles Centre scholar, the mouthful of a title, Joan, who is an artist, and she does both kind of performance art, but also makes artist books. And so she's currently in residence at the BL doing a project around death and dying, and she makes it a lot more fun than that sounds. It's really engaging. Yeah, speaker and generally lovely person. So there we go. So that's just to jump through some different examples. I mean, all of those projects have different types of outputs, and I think that's another sort of interesting thing to think about when we're thinking about practice-based research is, you know, what are the ways in which we share this knowledge? And I've put a few sort of examples there. It's, you know, they're very broad, the different outputs that we use, and we do have our own research repository as a way of trying to capture some of this kind of variety, and to you know, to make more visible the work that we do. The BL actually has a shared research repository project, which some of you may be familiar with, which we host and support other GLAM organisations, other galleries, libraries, archives, museums, to make their own research outputs available. So, as it says, the shared research repository for cultural and heritage organisations. And that in itself has been quite an interesting research endeavour in research infrastructure, and my colleagues behind that have done a lot of kind of scoping and working with the developers to think through what, like, you know, what the particular types of research that we do as GLAM organisations need. So that's an interesting one. And then finally, just my last slide was just a little prompt, I suppose. I think maybe linking into the conversation for later, but also perhaps into the second session, thinking about you know, actually some of what's really special about us in the sort of in the kind of the non-academic or the kind of quasi-academic, and there's obviously lots of, many people have views, lots of ways to describe us. But you know, we have, and I suppose some of this is particularly as an organisation that isn't attached to a university, which I know probably does have different context. But yes, our research environment is really diverse, and that's, I think, exciting and something that we should, that we should celebrate. And yes, the quality of research isn't defined by assessment frameworks. Again, this does maybe more speaks to our context inside the library. So I'd be interested to hear from colleagues as to kind of how these land. But you know, there's more freedom if you're not, you know, contributing to research assessment exercises, for example, and also that inclusivity that that William mentioned earlier, you know, the fact that we do have a whole range of roles and professional expertise and that we can draw on in our research environment. And yeah, the fact that we work with some really exciting collections, you know, collections of data, complex emerging formats, you know, all these different ways that knowledge is circulating and being reused, I think give us some really exciting options for experimentation. So I will leave it there. I hope that's been helpful. I realize that's a bit of a trot through, but yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. So thank you very much.